I've always been the type who loves my own company. I moved into this apartment about a year ago after landing my first stable job. It was small but cozy, and best of all, it was in a quiet neighborhood. I felt safe there. My days were pretty routine. Work, binging shows on the couch, reading before bed. A normal life, until the night everything changed. Even now, just thinking about it sends chills down my spine. The noises started subtly, like faint creaks in the kitchen. I figured it was just the old building settling, or maybe the plumbing. It's an old place, after all. I didn't pay much attention, but over the past few weeks, those noises got louder, more frequent, and strangely distinct. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd hear what sounded like soft footsteps, but I convinced myself it was all in my head. I mean, who could be in my kitchen on the 3rd floor? That particular night, I was especially exhausted. I'd stayed late at work and barely had the energy to fix myself something to eat before crashing into bed. I put my phone on silent, not wanting any interruptions. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. This time, it wasn't like the usual creaks or random noises. It was a footstep, clear as day, followed by another and then another. My heart started racing as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my upstairs neighbor. Maybe I was imagining things. But then I heard something I couldn't ignore. The faint creak of my bedroom door, which I always leave slightly ajar, slowly opening. I froze, my heart pounding. There was no doubt now. Someone was inside my apartment. My hands were trembling as I reached slowly for my phone. I called the police but kept the line on mute, trying not to make a sound. As I waited, I heard the most terrifying noise yet. The doorknob to my bedroom started to turn. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt frozen, and I was clutching my phone so tightly my fingers started to tingle. The sound of the doorknob twisting was slow, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to know they were there. Taking a deep breath, I mustered every ounce of courage I had and slid over to the door to lock it. The lock was simple, nothing too secure, but at that moment, it felt like my only lifeline. The second I heard the soft click of the lock, everything went silent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then, there it was, a light push against the door. It wasn't forceful, more like they were testing it, checking to see how much resistance there was. Sweat started to drip down my face, and my breathing was shaky. I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating but not leaving entirely. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant wail of sirens growing closer. As the sound of the sirens got louder, I heard a window in the kitchen slide open. The intruder was making their escape. I waited a few more seconds, barely daring to breathe, before peeking through the small crack in my bedroom door. The hallway was empty, but I could hear hurried footsteps in the kitchen, followed by a dull thud. Gathering every bit of courage I had, I unlocked the door and bolted for the front of my apartment. Just as I opened it, 2 police officers were rushing up the stairs. I quickly told the officers what had happened, still out of breath, and led them to the kitchen. That's when I noticed the open window, and worse, a ladder propped up outside, reaching directly to it. My apartment is on the 3rd floor. There was no way anyone could have gotten up there without help. One of the officers inspected the ladder and found out it had been taken from my downstairs neighbor's apartment, which was on the ground floor. That realization made me feel sick. This neighbor wasn't someone I saw often, but I knew he'd been living there for months. The idea that he might have been planning this for a while made my skin crawl. Then came the worst part, watching the footage from my own security cameras. Seeing that man walking through my kitchen, down the hallway, and opening my bedroom door shook me to my core. He moved so casually, like he'd done it before. But the moment that will haunt me forever, it was when he leaned over me while I was sleeping, took pictures with his phone, and just stood there, watching me. I couldn't stop thinking. How many times had he done this without me knowing? The police came back the next day to investigate further, and things only got more unsettling. They went to check the neighbor's apartment, but just like the night before, it was completely empty. It was like he'd never lived there at all. Even the rental records were a dead end. He'd used fake documents to move in. My stomach churned at the thought of how much planning must have gone into this. From the stolen ladder to the precise timing, everything about it felt calculated. After that, my life completely changed. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom anymore. For weeks, I set up a makeshift bed in the living room near the front door, where I felt a little less exposed. I installed reinforced locks on every door and window, added extra cameras, and even changed the layout of my furniture to block certain entrances. But no matter what I did, that feeling of safety never came back. Every little noise made me jump, and I barely slept, always expecting him to return. The worst part was the lack of answers. Who was he? Why was he doing this? To this day, I don't know. The police never found him, and eventually, the investigation went cold. The building management made efforts to improve security, but for me, none of it mattered. The fear of knowing someone had been so close, so deliberate in invading my space, is something I carry with me every day. Now, I never ignore strange sounds at night, no matter how small. I learned the hard way that what seems like paranoia could be the one thing keeping you alive. My parents went out that night to a family party, and since I wasn't really in the mood to sit around listening to conversations about relatives I barely know, I decided to stay home. I had a simple plan: play video games until late, maybe order a pizza. Nothing special. It was something I'd done plenty of times before, so I wasn't too worried about being home alone. After they left, I locked the front door and plopped onto the couch with my controller in hand. I got so into the game that I didn't even notice the hours passing until a strange noise broke the silence. It was subtle, like a faint creak coming from the dining room, but enough to make me glance back. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Houses make random noises sometimes, especially at night, so I brushed it off and went back to my game. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. A few minutes later, I had that weird sensation, the one where it feels like someone's watching you. The living room has a sliding glass door that leads to the backyard, and it's always creeped me out a little when I'm alone. Still, I tried to ignore it. But then I noticed something on the door. A faint foggy mark, like someone had just breathed on the glass. I froze for a second, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the temperature difference between inside and outside. But then it hit me. It wasn't cold outside that night. My stomach dropped. I slowly got up from the couch, my heart pounding. Every step toward the glass door felt heavier as I tried to convince myself there was a rational explanation. Maybe I'd left the door open earlier, and it was just the humidity seeping in. But as I got closer, I saw something that sent chills down my spine. The mark on the glass wasn't alone. There was a faint, defined spot right in the center, like someone had pressed their nose against the door. It looked fresh, like it had just happened seconds ago. That's when I noticed the door wasn't locked. I couldn't remember leaving it unlocked, and that realization made my panic worse. My breathing got heavy, and it felt like the air in the room had thickened. My first instinct was to lock the door immediately, but I hesitated before touching the handle. What if someone was still on the other side? The glass only reflected the light from the room, and the backyard was too dark to see anything. I tried to calm my breathing, but it was impossible. My mind raced through every terrifying scenario I could think of. Someone breaking in, or worse, already being inside. My phone was in my bedroom, which meant I'd have to cross the house to get to it. Nothing seemed like a good idea. Running outside, locking myself in a room, or even calling the cops. I felt completely trapped, caught between sheer panic and the fear of making the wrong move. I decided to head back to the couch and grab something, anything, that could work as a weapon. The closest thing was a glass bottle sitting on the coffee table. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it as I moved through the room. I tried to stay quiet, but every step felt louder than it should have. My plan was simple: get to my bedroom, grab my phone, and lock myself in the bathroom until help arrived. But as I was inching away from the living room, I heard it again. A soft, creaking sound coming from the kitchen. It wasn't random. It sounded like someone stepping on the floor. My mind went into full-blown panic mode. The kitchen was right next to the living room, and the only way to the bedroom was through there. I strained my ears, trying to pick up another sound, but everything had gone dead silent. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Still, I had to check. Slowly, I moved closer to the kitchen doorway, peeking around the corner. It looked empty, but something felt off. Then I noticed it. The back door, which also has a glass panel, was slightly open. I was 100% sure I'd locked it earlier. My chest tightened, and the panic turned into full-on dread. My head was spinning as I tried to piece it all together. I knew I'd locked that door, which meant someone had come in. I glanced at the floor near the doorway and saw faint scuff marks on the rug, like something heavy had been dragged across it. The realization hit me like a truck. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. I couldn't stay frozen in place any longer. Fighting the fear, I bolted toward my bedroom, gripping the bottle so hard it felt like my fingers would cramp. My legs felt like jelly, and I nearly tripped over myself as I reached the door. The second I was inside, I slammed it shut and locked it. With my phone finally in my hand, my first instinct was to call the cops. But my fingers were trembling so much it took me a few tries just to unlock the screen. As I was about to dial, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway. It wasn't creaking from the house settling. These were actual, steady steps, coming closer. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I held my breath, barely able to think, as the sound stopped right outside my door. Then, the worst part. The doorknob started to turn, slowly, as if whoever was out there was testing how secure the lock was. I was completely frozen, gripping the bottle like my life depended on it. The doorknob kept turning, slow and deliberate, and every second felt like an eternity. My mind was screaming at me to do something, shout, fight, anything, but I couldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the turning stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I leaned closer to the door, straining to hear anything, but it was dead quiet. The footsteps started again, this time moving away. They were slow and steady, heading back down the hallway. I couldn't tell if I felt relieved or more terrified. When I finally managed to call the cops, my voice was shaky and I could barely get the words out. They told me to stay locked in the room and stay on the line until they arrived. I sat there, every noise in the house amplifying my paranoia. I was sure the person was still in the house, waiting, maybe even watching. The sound of sirens in the distance was the only thing that gave me a sliver of relief. When the cops finally showed up and cleared the house, they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing, just me, scared out of my mind. Even though the cops didn't find anyone, I knew what I saw and heard. The marks on the glass, the open door, the footsteps in the hall. There was no way I imagined all of that. After they left, I couldn't bring myself to stay in the house alone. I waited on the porch until my parents came home and told them everything. They tried to calm me down, saying it was probably just some prank, or maybe I had left the door unlocked by accident. But I knew better. Someone was there, and they knew exactly how to scare me. To this day, I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. Nothing like this ever happened again, but that night left a mark on me. I'm obsessive about locking every door and window now, even when I'm home. But every time I'm alone at night, I can't shake the feeling that someone's watching. It's like I'm stuck in that moment, staring at the fogged glass and wondering who or what was on the other side. I'm not the kind of guy who goes out much, but that night my friends convinced me to join them at a party in a neighborhood a bit far from downtown. I don't drink a lot, so I ended up being more sober than everyone else in the group. When I decided to leave, it was already past 2 a.m., and everyone was way too drunk to drive me home. I pulled out my phone, opened the rideshare app, and booked a ride. The driver showed up quickly, seemed normal, so I got in without thinking much about it. I was tired and just wanted to get home. At first, everything felt fine. The guy said good morning, technically it was, since it was already early morning, and asked how the party was. Just small talk, nothing unusual. But about 10 minutes into the ride, he started asking questions that felt off. Do you live alone? Does anyone know where you are? I let out a nervous laugh and tried to change the subject, but he kept prying. That's when I started paying more attention to the route. He was slowing down on streets that should have been quick. It felt like he was waiting for something, or someone. I got really uneasy and decided to check the route on the app. He wasn't completely off course, but he wasn't taking the most direct path either. I casually asked, "Hey, is there an issue with the route?" The GPS was showing another way. He gave this short, almost mocking laugh and said, "Oh, I just prefer quieter streets at night. Don't like driving through busy areas at this hour." It sounded reasonable enough, but the whole vibe was strange. I stayed quiet after that, staring out the window and trying to figure out what I'd do if things went sideways. That's when he slowed down even more and said, "Damn, I think there's something wrong with the car. Let me check." He stopped in the middle of a deserted street surrounded by empty lots. No streetlights, nothing around. My heart was pounding. He got out without turning off the engine and walked to the front of the car. I hesitated, debating whether to stay inside or step out too, but before I could decide, I noticed a shadow moving near the car. Another man appeared out of nowhere, stepping out of the darkness like he'd been waiting there all along. I froze for a second, trying to process what was happening. The guy who appeared looked jumpy, glancing toward me and whispering something to the driver. That's when it hit me. They were working together. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, but they had me boxed in. The driver came up to my door, knocking on the window with this weird grin on his face, saying, "Hey, come out here for a second. I need your help." Meanwhile, the other guy stayed on the opposite side of the car, like he was waiting for his turn. It felt like I was caught in some kind of trap. Trying to buy time, I acted like I was grabbing my phone and said, "Sure, I'll get out in a second. Just need to call a friend real quick." The driver's smile dropped instantly, and his tone turned sharp. "Get out of the car now, man. I don't have all night." Meanwhile, the second guy started moving toward my side of the car, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Before they could react, I shoved the door open hard, hitting the driver, and bolted. I didn't look back, didn't think, just ran like my life depended on it. The cold night air hit me as I sprinted down the deserted street, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. I could hear them yelling behind me, but I didn't dare slow down or turn around. The road felt endless, with no houses or cars in sight, just darkness all around. My legs were burning, and I could hear them getting closer, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. I kept running, fueled by pure adrenaline and the overwhelming need to get away. After what felt like forever, I saw something up ahead, headlights. A car was coming from the opposite direction. It felt like a miracle, like a tiny shred of hope in the middle of all that fear. I waved my arms and screamed as loud as I could, almost stumbling into the road. The car slowed down, but I knew the guys chasing me were still right behind me. They suddenly stopped, as if realizing their game was over. I glanced back and saw them turning around, heading back toward their car. The car stopped a few feet away, and I practically threw myself in front of it, still yelling for help. It was a small sedan, and the driver, clearly confused, rolled down the window. Before he could even ask what was going on, I blurted out, "Please, help me. They're chasing me." I was gasping for air, completely out of breath, but I managed to point toward the two guys who were now getting into their car. The driver looked in their direction, hesitated for a second, then unlocked the back door. "Get in, quick," he said, and I didn't think twice. As the car sped off, I looked back and saw the other car was now idling. But they didn't follow us. They just stayed there, like they were deciding whether it was worth it to keep going. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, but the guy driving the sedan seemed calm. like he'd seen worse. "You're lucky I was passing by," he said, but I didn't ask him any more questions. I was too shaken up and just wanted to get somewhere safe. A few minutes later, he dropped me off at a gas station, where I finally called the police to report what had happened. They promised to send a patrol to check the area, but honestly, I didn't know what they'd find. What could I even say? Two guys tried to make me get out of a car in the middle of nowhere? Would anyone believe me? I sat at the gas station for what felt like hours, trying to piece everything together. When the cops arrived, I explained as much as I could, but I didn't have a license plate number, and their faces were already blurred in my memory. The officers took my statement, but I never heard back. To this day, I don't know what those guys wanted. If it was a robbery, why all the theatrics? And if it was something worse, well, I don't even want to think about that. All I know is, since that night, I've never gotten into a ride share without triple checking everything first. I've been working as a barista for about 2 years, and I've always enjoyed it. Our cafe is small but cozy, and we have regulars who come in almost every day. Usually, I recognize the faces and even know their orders by heart. It was always a pretty chill routine until I started noticing one particular customer who made me feel uneasy. He was a man in his 40s, always wearing this bulky jacket, even on warmer days. At first, he was just another face in the crowd, but over time, his visits started standing out for all the wrong reasons. He never seemed genuinely interested in the coffee. He was more focused on talking to me. Things got weirder when he began asking more personal questions. He wanted to know where I lived, if I lived alone, and even what my work schedule looked like. I tried to steer the conversation away, answering vaguely, but he was persistent. One time, he made a comment like, "You always close up alone, don't you? That must be dangerous." That set off alarm bells in my head. It was the first time I thought about mentioning him to my manager, but I hesitated. I didn't want to seem paranoid since he hadn't technically done anything threatening. Still, something about him just didn't sit right with me. That specific night, I was closing the cafe by myself, like usual. It was around 10 p.m., and the street outside was almost empty, except for a car passing here and there. I was locking up the front door when I heard this noise coming from the side of the building. It sounded like footsteps, but when I looked, there was no one there. I brushed it off and kept locking up, but my heart was already racing. Once I finished, I turned to head toward the parking lot where I kept my bike, and there he was, standing by the wall, wearing that same jacket. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there staring at me. I tried to act like I hadn't noticed him and kept walking, but he stepped toward me and said, in this weirdly calm voice, "You must get tired of always closing up alone." That's when I froze. He moved closer way too fast for me to react. Before I knew it, he was within arm's reach, trying to grab me. My first instinct was to scream, but the sound barely came out. I managed to shove him as hard as I could and took off running toward the main street. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might stop, but adrenaline kept me going. Luckily, 2 customers who had left earlier were still nearby, chatting by their car. I ran straight to them, yelling for help. The couple immediately stepped out of their car when they saw me running toward them, clearly panicked. I could barely get the words out, but I think my fear said enough. When I turned back to look, the man had stopped following me, but he was still there, standing on the sidewalk, almost like he was trying to decide what to do next. The guy from the couple shouted something at him, and without saying a word, the man turned around and walked quickly toward a nearby alley. My whole body was shaking, and I felt completely vulnerable. I couldn't stop staring in the direction he had gone, afraid he'd come back at any second. Once he was out of sight, the couple insisted I call the police. They stayed with me while I tried to explain what happened, but deep down, I knew there wasn't much the cops could do. When they showed up, they asked some questions and promised to patrol the area, but it all felt like a formality. The guy hadn't done anything serious enough to be treated as an immediate threat. That sense of helplessness was what hit me the hardest. Even after everything, I couldn't be sure I was safe in the place I worked every day. That night, when I finally got home, there was no way I could sleep. Every little noise made me jump, like he might show up outside my window. I kept replaying the moment he tried to grab me, wondering what would have happened if the couple hadn't been there. The next day, I told my manager everything. He was visibly concerned and promised I wouldn't have to close up by myself for a while. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasiness. For days, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, both at work and outside. The strangest part is, he never came back to the cafe. I kept expecting to see him again, maybe to confront him with someone else there for backup, but it was like he disappeared. At the same time, that wasn't exactly comforting. I couldn't stop wondering if he was watching me from somewhere else, waiting for the right moment to try again. That uncertainty was the most terrifying part. I couldn't forget the look he gave me that night. So calm, so deliberate. Like he had planned it all and just didn't expect me to react or for anyone else to be around. Even as time passed, the impact of that night didn't fade. I couldn't walk down the street at night without my heart racing, and every time a new customer came into the cafe, I was on edge, analyzing every move they made. My manager suggested I take a week off, and I did, hoping it would help. But even at home, the fear stayed with me. It felt like someone was always watching me, even when I knew I was alone. It wasn't just the memory of what happened. It was the not knowing. How much did he know about me? Had he been following me before that night? Eventually, I decided to quit my job. What used to be something I loved became a constant source of anxiety. To this day, I can't stop wondering why he chose me. Did I unknowingly give him some kind of signal? Was he doing this to other people too? And what scares me the most is that I never got any answers. I don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went. He just vanished after that night, like it was a one-off incident in my life. But the fear he left behind is still with me. It's like a shadow that never quite goes away. Every now and then, I catch myself looking over my shoulder or scanning a room full of strangers, wondering if he's somewhere out there, watching. The way it all happened so suddenly and ended just as quickly still haunts me. It's like the worst kind of unfinished story, one I'll never have closure for.